Hello, I'm Belva Davis, and welcome to This Week in Northern California. Joining me on this special night, my last as host here, are Jill Tucker, San Francisco Chronicle education reporter; Lisa Vorderbrueggen, Bay Area News Group's politics and government reporter; Paul Rogers, environment writer for the San Jose Mercury News; and Carla Marinucci, San Francisco Chronicle senior political reporter. Carla, you get to have all the fun. You were in Chicago on Tuesday night. Tell us, what was it like? Were people there surprised at the short drama?
Well, you know, Belva, we were in the snows of New Hampshire and in Florida together covering this race. You know how dramatic it was all the way through, and just amazing to be there on that final night. This was a much different election night than 2008, when 250,000 people greeted this sort of landmark moment. Barack Obama is more weathered. He's all graying, but boy, the Democrats there, it was just pandemonium. And I think this time it was tears of relief instead of joy. That this contest has been so tough, so expensive, and so important in so many ways, and we saw so negative that I think people are glad it's over. But to be there and to watch the president give that address, and we heard him today in Washington talk about what happens now in this country. I think the Republicans learned from this election. What we saw in this election, we've seen in California decades before. The ethnic vote, the Latino vote, the youth vote, the women's vote. This has been an electorate that has made a difference, has reshaped California politics, and we've seen what's happened here with the Republicans now down to 29%.
Well, we're going to turn to Paul, because Paul has some special powers. You were on a program at the end of last year, Paul, and you actually made an election prediction on that show. So we're going to see just how close you came. All right, so Paul, you want to take a swing at it?
Mitt Romney will survive the challenge from Newt Gingrich, and Barack Obama will win narrowly re-election with 290 electoral votes, because he will win the state of Ohio on the strength of saving the auto industry.
Well, Paul,
the amazing
I was a little too conservative. I didn't get.
Well, you're wrong on the electoral votes.
I didn't get Florida for him in that column.
So, what are your thoughts now? I mean, what made you so sure that was going to be our future?
A couple of things, basically. No incumbent president. You know, there's a lot of noise that we hear day to day in political coverage, and this person made this gaffe, or that person had this many people at their rally. But the truth is, no incumbent president who has not had a challenge from his own party in the primary has lost re-election since 1932. Herbert Hoover. It's almost impossible to defeat an incumbent president when his party is unified. There was that. Second, the auto bailout was an enormous issue. I used to live in Ohio. I worked for the Cincinnati Enquirer. I have family in Cincinnati and Toledo. 1 in 7 jobs in Ohio is related to the auto industry. And there were 10,000 people working at that Jeep plant in Toledo. That community was terrified. And they had a clear black and white choice on that one issue. Who was for them, who wasn't for them. And then finally, there was a weak field. I mean, let's be honest. The primary candidates were one of the weakest fields that the Republicans had ever run. The big guns, the Jeb Bushes, they sat it out. And so it was going to be hard, even with the bad economy, for Obama to lose.
And I think you're right, Paul. I mean, it wasn't just jobs in the economy. It was climate change. It was reproductive rights. It was gay marriage. There were a lot of issues that have changed in the last 10 years, and the Republicans just did not.
The demographic shift, this is a realignment election, one of those things that happens once in a generation, where in 1980, 91% of the people who voted for president were white in the United States. Last Tuesday, it was 72%. That number is going to continue to change. And the Republican Southern strategy for 50 years that they have had, which is reach out to mostly rural, mostly religious, mostly older white people, the math does not add up anymore. Barack Obama had an 80-40 strategy. You win 80% of the non-white vote which is 30%, and you win 40% of the white vote. Add that together, you get 52%. That's what he did.
You know what I thought was interesting, though? It would seem a lot of people are talking about how this election was a wake-up call for the Republicans, and what was, that they're going to have to court the Hispanic vote, they're going to have to start addressing immigration, climate change, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, the same thing you were talking about happened in California, and yet, that the Republicans needed to wake up in California, and yet where are we today in California?
You're absolutely right.
Yes, the California Republican Party chairman came out with the almost exact same rhetoric that he's been coming out with for years. I didn't detect any wake-up tone in his press release.
In fact, the chairman of the California Democratic Party was almost ignored at the Republican National Convention. He was sort of a sideline guy because he's the big tent guy. He's the guy that wanted to bring all the minority groups into the process.
No, you're right, and it wasn't just some of the issues in the demographics. Let's talk about technology, too. When you talk about, I went to Nevada, I went to Colorado, to see the get out the vote effort, the Obama team, and it was on social media as well. Even in the last hours of this election, there were Californians on the phone getting emails from the Obama campaign, making phone calls with touchscreen. I mean, this was beyond what anyone had ever seen, and the Republicans were just washed out when it came to that.
2008, the turnout was not an anomaly. They got the turnout again. They were able to get everybody out.
Well, Jill, you were with the old guy who created a few miracles, too. His cause, education. What does the passage of Proposition 30 mean to educators and children?
Well, in California, that sound you heard was the collective sigh of relief of 400,000 teachers on election night that they are not going to have these trigger cuts. And Jerry Brown pushed that through. It did not look good prior to Election Day, but I will say in California, the unions, like in some other states, made a big difference for the Democrats and for
The
this.
youth vote
And
made
the
a
youth
huge
vote.
difference,
The parents were out, teachers were out. The union really got people organized to get the vote out at the last minute, and it wasn't as close as people thought.
Why did those polls show it being so far off and then have it, win?
I think a lot of people didn't want to vote for it. They felt a little bullied by it, but in the end, they just couldn't go to the ballot box and say no and have all these cuts. So it really, for schools in California, it's not as if they're going to get this huge amount of money and things are going to all of a sudden be better. It basically keeps the status quo. And the big question that I have is, what does this supermajority in Sacramento now mean? I mean, are they going to be able to restore funding in schools? Are they going to make that a priority on top of having just passed Prop 30?
Prop 30 to me was huge for two reasons. One, for Jerry Brown's legacy. If he would have lost that, the rest of his governorship would have been miserable.
That would have been it.
It would have been cut, and he may well have not run for re-election because of that. Instead, he now has the wind at his back. And second, and I think this is most important, since 1998 in California, we have been talking about the budget is broken, a structural deficit. California is Greece. It can't get its house in order. The budget is now balanced. I mean, it's like you can't even believe it, but the budget is basically balanced. And yes, there are some problems here and there, but this is the closest we've been in 15 years. It's an amazing.
And we got to turn to Lisa and find out, but some of the things locally that happened too.
Yes. Of course, hundreds and hundreds of local ballot measures on, and the big talk around even across the nation was in Richmond, where the very first tax in the nation on soda, it's an anti-obesity measure, went down in flames. It fizzled big time. 70% of the voters said, nope, Richmond does not want to be singled out for the fat people's tax. They just don't want it, and they said no. Oakland zoo tax went down. No money for the critters, I guess. Alameda County transportation tax on the cusp. Fire tax in Contra Costa County went down a huge amount. 4 or 5 fire stations are going to close in the biggest part of the county starting in January. And in Berkeley, it is still legal to sit on the sidewalk. Voters said, nope, we're not going to go after the homeless. I always thought stepping over the homeless in Berkeley was part of the experience, right?
What about Berkeley? What about the Berkeley mayor's race? Do we still have Tom Bates?
Mr. Tom Bates survived the ranked choice voting effort to try to have a replica of what happened in Oakland when Don Parada lost to Jean Quan. The big question was, as Tom Bates loved ranked choice voting before the election, was he going to love it after? And he now is apparently still a fan.
What about the first test of the top 2 primary system and redistricting in the Pete Stark race, where a lot of people thought 20-term dean of the congressional delegation was never going to be defeated by a young prosecutor.
Well, but you know, Pete Stark had a couple of things working against him. One, of course, was Pete Stark. You know, he behaved badly. And Eric Swalwell, the challenger who won, 31-year-old Dublin councilman, prosecutor, he had 2 bites at that apple. So unlike prior years where he would have lost in the primary, he now gets to come back.
Two
in the
Democrats
general,
against each other.
2 Democrats against each other, and with Pete Stark
a real test.
behaving very badly on several fronts. I think those 2 things
What about
conspired to-
Oakland? They have a new city council?
Yeah, they've got some new members of the city council. Ignacio de la Fuente's off the council for the first time in many years, and a big, hard, fat battle with Rebecca Kaplan, who is a very ambitious, up-and-coming politician. I think we're going to see more of her, and maybe it's just a time for the changing of the guard, so to speak. So
Well, Mayor Kwan, for once, seems pleased to go to work with her colleagues.
we'll see how long that lasts, right? You know, it is Oakland. We'll see.
Well, in San Francisco, another little note, in the election here on our own legislative body, we haven't for almost 20 years had 2 black people on the Board of Supervisors, and we do now, connecting the 2 areas where minorities live, that is the Bayview Hunters Point and the Fillmore District. So things, this was an unusually active and changing the guard election season.
Yeah, I think so. And when we talk about, Jerry Brown, some of the issues, Californians had a message. It kind of went against the grain of other states saying, I'm willing to pay the tax to save my schools. And on the issue of climate change, 39 was another proposition where they said, we're willing to approve a tax.
Yeah, we're in danger in California of losing our reputation as an anti-tax state. I mean, I've heard that out, out in the national media.
It's important to remember on both of those taxes, 30 and 39, most of the people voting, the vast majority, were not having to pay the tax, right?
Right. That's always an
other than the
advantage.
sales tax portion of Brown's tax, most of that was upper income. And Prop 39 closed a loophole in out-of-state companies, and that's going to bring in $1 billion more a year to California. Half of that money is going in the first 5 years to renewable energy projects, energy efficiency projects at schools. It's going to create a lot of jobs. And its champion, Tom Steyer, the San Francisco financier who put $29 million into it, is probably going to be a gubernatorial candidate sometime in the next decade.
If not a cabinet.
Yes, energy secretary when she leaves.
Yes.
Jill, explain why Proposition 38 went down, and that was the other education.
Well, I think part of it was the amount of money that the teachers union spent against it, and the governor coming out and saying, "Look, we just have to get this done." But it went down by a greater margin than I thought. There were a lot of people who voted for both, sort of hinging their bets, and I think there was a lot on the ballot for all voters, and I thought to a large degree they seemed very thoughtful.
Well, and to Paul's point, I think a lot of people would have had to pay under the Munger
that's right.
legislation.
Everybody
and
had to pay
everybody
Munger.
versus,
Yeah,
whereas
right.
under the other, I'm not in that category, maybe, so.
Turning back to the national scene, we're going to see some changes in the new administration in Washington.
Well, there are some Californians. We talked about Tom Steyer, the proponent of Prop 39, who's a billionaire hedge fund manager, but also somebody who has shown a record to get things through. He worked on with George Schultz on another climate change related ballot measure. This is a guy to watch. Energy Secretary, you mentioned possibly. People have talked about Kamala Harris, the former district attorney of San Francisco and now attorney general. She has been all over the Obama campaign. Very important surrogate for him. People look to her to have some kind of role in the administration. People have looked at Steve Wesley, former state controller, as another example, and Antonio Villaraigosa, mayor of Los Angeles, possibly Secretary of Transportation.
Except maybe not so much Pelosi, right?
And then there's speculation. What happens to Nancy Pelosi? Will
She was one of the rare Democratic losers from the Bay Area in this election. She didn't regain the House.
Hardest worker ends up
Hard worker.
never gets to take home the kitty.
Yeah.
But also 3 strikes was a surprise.
Yeah, I think that may have been something where people were looking again at the cost, but they weren't willing to go so far as to overturn the death penalty. It was also interesting on the genetically modified food, Prop 37. A lot of money came in from big food companies to defeat that, but people in the Bay Area who were surprised, that was poorly worded in some ways, and they didn't make a clear case that genetically modified food is dangerous to eat, because that hasn't been made scientifically.
Last word with Lisa. What happened with the Ricky Gill McNerney race.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, we always have to remember that district where Jerry McNerney swooped in and beat Richard Pombo out. Now he survived his election. The 25-year-old recent law school graduate, Ricky Gill, the hope of the party, fizzled out as well, along with the soda tax. So he didn't rise to the occasion.
Boy, do we
after all.
live in an exciting time.
We do, we do.
So everybody has enough work to go ahead just to understand what the voters were saying.
An embarrassment of riches in this state, yeah.